right, in this lesson, we'll be talking about how to add simple materials onto 3D objects like our character, our floor, and the falling blocks. We'll be customizing simple, colorful materials. Also, in this lesson, we'll be adding an environment texture into our world because right now in our 3D viewport, you can see this sky and ground material, but when we play our game, it just simply looks like this. So we'll be adding a sky material like this, and we'll be able to customize it, its colors, including the color of the light that the sky actually projects onto the scene as well. Lastly, we'll be adjusting just a few of our project's render settings so that our project looks a little bit better when we're playing our game. But let's go ahead and jump in. The first thing I'll do is I'm actually going to go ahead and select the mesh object, the mesh instance of my floor, because right now my floor is just gray. To add a material to the floor, I'm going to find in the floor object and recall that our floor has three parts that are right inside of our main level 1 scene. We have the static body, we have the mesh instance, as well as the collision shape. What we actually see, of course, is the mesh instance. And if I select that mesh instance 3D node and go over to the inspector, well, we have a mesh resource that I can go ahead and click on the little thumbnail of to hide the details of it, or click on it again to expand out all of that resource's properties. What I'm going to do is go to the resources material property, which is currently empty, and click on the little arrow next to it and say new standard material 3D. There are different types of materials that you can add. We're only going to be going over the most simple version to add colors and customize the look of the material using a standard material 3D. So I'll go ahead and click on that. When we add a material to a mesh instance, well, it gives it a default kind of a white flat material. If I orbit around, you can see that there's no reflections or shininess about it at all. So if I want to customize not only the color of the material, but also other properties like how shiny or reflective it is, how metallic the material is, I can click on the material's little thumbnail. This material is actually a resource that we're creating that our mesh resource is looking at. So it's kind of a resource inside of a resource, if you will. If I go ahead and I've expanded out that material resource properties, you can see that it has its own list of many, many different types of properties. The basic color of a material is called its albedo property. So if I expand out albedo, you can see there is a color picker box right here. If I go ahead and click on that color box, which is just white, it gives me a color picker, which I can choose a color using either red, green, and blue primary colors, or I can switch the color picker to hue, saturation, and value, or raw. I like using hue, saturation, and value, so I can pick a color of the rainbow called a hue. I can turn up the saturation of the color. It's not updating in this circle for some reason. I think that's a little bug. And I can change the value from light to dark. So if I choose a color for my floor, I'm going to choose kind of a dark purpley color. And there we go, maybe a little bit more blue. If I just click away from that color picker and then I go back to it, I think the color picker will now update. So that's a little bug in Godot, I think. I like that color. What else can we change about the floor in terms of its material properties? Well, like in Blender, you can make an object's material look metallic. If you want it to look like it's metal, you can open up that metallic section and turn up metallic from 0 all the way up to 1. You won't see very much though, because the way that an object looks metallic is when light is reflecting on it, and the color of the reflections on the metallic object will really sell the fact that it's metallic or not. So you know what? I'm going to actually turn that down to 0. I don't think I want it to be metallic. One other thing that we can change is the roughness of the material. This is looking a lot like Blender, by the way. The roughness is how shiny and reflective the object is versus how dull or flat the material is. Right now, the roughness is turned all the way up to 1, so it's not shiny or reflective at all. If I turn that value down, it will be more reflective. But because this is a game engine and you can turn lots of these features like reflections on and off, you might not see reflections as you expect in your game level until you adjust some of your project and environment settings. So keep that in mind. Let's go ahead and add a material to our character. My character is called Steve. Steve, however, is an instance of a scene, so I can't see his different parts, including his collision shape and his mesh. So I'm going to go ahead and jump into Steve's scene by clicking on the little Steve clapboard scene icon right here. When I do that, of course, Steve's scene will open up in a new tab where I can select his mesh instance 3D and go over to the inspector. Now, just a word for the wise here, there's actually two different places that we can add a material onto a mesh instance 3D. There is a section called Surface Material Override, and if I open that section up, you can see that there is a material with an index of 0, and I can actually go ahead in here and add a standard material onto the mesh. However, I'm going to recommend that you don't use this Surface Material Override section, because what you're essentially doing is overriding or replacing any material that's properly on the mesh instance itself. So I'm going to recommend that you click on the thumbnail of your mesh resource and then go in the mesh resources properties, not down to surface material override, instead just to the material property, where you can again click on the little arrow, click on new standard material 3D. And once you've done that, you can simply click on its thumbnail to expand out that material resource and change its properties, like its albedo color. I'll go ahead and add a greeny color using hue saturation value to my main character, maybe a little bit more yellow actually. I'll go ahead and turn down the lightness ever so slightly, and I think I'm happy with that. I'm not going to change any of the other material properties for my character, so I'll save this scene now, Control S, and I'll go back to level 1, and you can see my little character is green. The falling blocks are also an instance of a scene each, so if I go into one of the scenes, just by clicking on its little clapboard here, I can select the mesh instance. I think you get the point. If I open up the mesh resource properties and then go to material, I can add a new standard material 3D, click on its thumbnail, and change its material properties. Very simply, I'm going to go ahead and add an albedo color. And what color, using hue saturation value, will I add to this falling block? I'm going to make it a light blue, like that, and I will save, Control S, and go back to level 1, and I have simple materials on all of my game objects. Good. Before I go ahead and test out my game, I think it's time to finally say goodbye to our little icon, our flat sprite 3D that's in our scene. So I'm going to go ahead and select my little icon. It was really just a demo to teach some coding earlier on in this course. So I'll select that node and right click on it and say delete nodes and press OK. Goodbye icon. Let's go ahead and save, Control S, and I'll press play scene. Our game will load and we have our materials, and of course I can collect that coin. However, as I pointed out in the last lesson, that coin in my game doesn't look very good because it's reflective, and right now what it has to reflect is basically nothing. It's a gray void. So I'm going to go ahead and add an environment into my scene. How do I do that? Well, I'm going to go ahead and select the root node of my scene, the node 3D called level 1, and I'm going to press the plus button to add a new node. The node that we're going to add is called world environment. If you search for world, you'll find it. I'll go ahead and double click. This world environment node needs to be a direct child of the root node in the scene, which it is because it's indented just one little tab in, and it's lined up with the other main objects like the blocks folder and the floor and the camera and Steve and coin 1. So if I select that world environment node and go over to the inspector, the environment property is empty. What I need to do here is create a new environment resource by clicking on the little arrow and say new environment. I'll go and click on new environment, and then there is an environment resource. What can you do with that? Well, if you click on the resource, it will expand out all of the environment's properties. And one of the things we can do is add a background into this environment. There are many more settings in here. We're going to explore just a few of them in this lesson, but under background, the current mode of the background is called clear color, and that gives us our boring gray. To change that, I can simply click on the little arrow and choose one of the options. I'll choose sky. I think that's the best one for us. And when I add a sky, well, our sky color isn't set up. And that is when I select the sky option, we now have a new section down here called sky, which wasn't there a moment ago. And if I open that section up, our sky is empty. So we're just seeing black. We now need to add a resource inside of or pointed to by our environment resource. So a resource inside of a resource. We've seen this before in this lesson. I'm going to go ahead and in my sky section, next to the sky property, add a new sky. And if I click on that resource, I can expand it out and I can give my sky a sky material. And guess what? This is a resource that we're going to add called a new procedural sky material. There are different types of skies that you can create, but procedural is the one that we're going to use in this lesson. So new procedural sky material, which is now a resource pointed to by a resource pointed to by our environment resource. Whew. When I do that, when I have all three, you can see now that we actually have created a default looking sky, horizon, and floor color. How can we customize these? Well, my procedural sky material, I can click on it to expand out its properties, where I can expand the sky section and change the sky color. I'll go ahead and choose this color picker to choose a sky color. I think I'm going to go with a pinky color. Maybe I can adjust the hue and saturation and value here. Maybe I'll make it a little bit more on the blue side, I think. Yeah, I like that. I think I'm going to change, I'll just click next to the color picker to hide it. I'm going to change the horizon color to be more of a pinky color. And the horizon color, because there is a blur to it, and because the horizon color expands out into the ground area and into the sky, there's actually two different horizon colors. There's one for the sky, and there's also one for the ground down here. So I'm going to try to match them as best as I can to make there not be a solid, sort of a stark line between the sky and the ground. So I'll choose a horizon color. It's going to be using hue, saturation, and value, kind of a pinky gray color. Maybe I'll make it lighter than that. That looks pretty good. To use the exact same color as this in another color picker, I can simply copy the hex code. The hex code is simply a code in hexadecimal, which can include numbers from 0 to 9, as well as A, B, C, D, E, or F. And if I simply copy those 6 digits, I'll press Control C, I can go down to my ground section to the horizon color and paste in that same code. Oh, you know what? It's actually not letting me paste in a code because I need to, for some reason, switch over to hue, saturation, and value, this color picker, and then I can select the existing code and paste in the hex color that I just copied and press enter. There we go. So now I have the exact same color for both horizon colors, and therefore there's a nice blend to it. How do I adjust the blurriness of the horizon? Well, that is the curve. The curve, if you grab this little curved line, you can make the horizon more sharp. In other words, this little corner and the sharpness of it will dictate how blurred out the horizon fuzziness color is. So the softer this curve, the more blurred out the horizon color is into the sky. So I'm going to make it a little bit sharper here, I think. I think I might also make the horizon curve a little bit more shallow in to the ground. And I think I'll make the bottom color of the ground a very dark, I'll use hue, saturation, and value, a very dark green, almost imperceivably green, just a little bit like a void down there. Do I like that? I think it looks pretty good. Let's go ahead and try this out. I'll press Control S to save. I will press play scene. And there it is. Okay. One thing you can do with resources that you create inside of Godot, like your environment or your sky or your procedural sky material, is you can save them to a file, and therefore you can reuse them in other parts of your game project. If I want to reuse this environment in my next game level, well, I could save this environment resource as a TRES or an RES resource. If I click next to environment on the little arrow, I'm not going to say new environment. This time I'm going to click on save. When you save a resource, it'll get an RES or a TRES file extension, and that's fine. I'm actually going to make a new folder in my project folder. So if I right click in my project folder where there's nothing else, I can say new folder. I'm going to name this folder resources, and I'll press OK. Inside of that resources folder, I will name this resource level 1 underscore environment. Now, keep in mind that this resource does not include unique instances of your procedural sky material or your sky itself. So if you want to save each one of those resources separately, if I go ahead and click on level 1 environment.tres here to expand it out, I could save my sky separately, as well as if I expand out the sky, I could save the procedural sky separately and then make copies of each one if I want to mix and match and recombine these in any way that I want. Okay, but I'm not going to get into that detail in this lesson. I think we're pretty good as it stands. One thing you might notice in your game level is that the color of the sky and horizon and floor are influencing the color of the light that's being projected onto everything in your whole scene. If you don't want that to happen, if you want your environment to just have more even, let's say white or whatever color of light projected on it and not necessarily have the influence of a deep blue sky casting light onto everything, what you can do is in your environment settings, not in the sky settings or the procedural material settings, if you go down to the section called ambient light and expand it out, there is a property called source. And right now the ambient light, that means the light that's all throughout the scene, is coming from the background of your environment, which is the procedural sky. If I don't want that to be the case, what I can do is I can simply say disabled. And you can see what that did. It took away any of the light projecting from the sky on all the objects. That doesn't look very good, so I'm not going to use disabled. Instead, I can simply say color if I want to, and I can have a color of light be the ambient color in my scene. I'll use my color picker right here. I'll use hue saturation value. I'll turn up the value, and I might like that. Okay, so now I have white light projecting onto my scene from every angle, filling in all of the shadows on the sides of the objects that aren't being directly illuminated by my scene's light. However, I think what you should do is actually use the background option. However, you can also, when you use background, which gives you that blue or your sky light and your environment color light projected onto all the objects, you can also combine in a color of ambient light as well and change the influence of the sky from 100% down to whatever percent that you actually want. So if I have this color set to white and I turn down the sky contribution value, this is a percentage, but in decimal format from 1 to 0. If I turn this percentage down, you might see that now the sides of my falling blocks aren't as much getting the sky color. If I turn it back up, you can see that they are getting blue projected onto them. Let's go ahead and make a more obvious example. If I make my color set to, let's use a bright orange here, like that, and like that. What I can do is change the sky contribution down, and you'll start to see that orange color, especially in the darker sections, really fill in, which doesn't look very good, I don't think. So I'm going to reset my color back to a white, and then I might use a sky contribution of something like 75% or so. Okay, let's go ahead and save. I'll press Control S. I'll press Play Scene just to see how things are looking. Things are looking pretty good. Although I kind of wish that my coin, the dollar sign on the coin was a little bit more legible. What's happening here is I believe in Blender I set up this material, the reflective metallic copper material, essentially. I made it too metallic or too reflective, I think, and so you can't really read things easily. It's reflecting the environment as much as possible, and we'll look at a few of the settings for that. But I think what I'll do here, just to make the coin look a little bit more even and flat, is I'm going to go into my coin scene. I'll press the little clapboard to jump into that separate scene, and on that mesh instance 3D, which doesn't look very good in here, but if I turn on my simulated environment, you'll see it better. What I can do is go into the meshes with my mesh instance selected, material property, which, because we took this model from Blender with the material coming from Blender, there is actually a surface 0 that we need to go into. There can actually be different materials on the same object, and therefore you might have different surfaces, like surface 0 for the first material, surface 1 for the second material. But here it is under surface 0. If I open up this material, you can see all of its properties. I think I changed the roughness a little bit to down. I'm going to change this to 0.4, so it's not quite as shiny as it was previously, but what that will do is make it more even and not reflect the environment quite so much. So if I press Control S to save, I can close this scene, and now back in level 1, you can see that maybe my coin is a bit more legible. Let's try that out. I'll press Control S to save. I'll press Play Scene, and there it is. Okay, I kind of like the look of that a little bit better. To finish off this lesson, I'm going to point out that there are some settings in Godot that, to keep your game simple and to keep it running on lower end hardware that's less capable, Godot has some pretty important settings turned off to make your scene look more realistic. If I go ahead and select my world environment node, if I go over to my environment's properties, this is where you're going to see some settings, including screen space reflections, SSR for short, which, if you enable screen space reflections, you will see reflections on objects that are not totally rough in your game environment. So you can see now that if I zoom in and kind of angle my camera, you can very faintly see the reflection of the green cube in my floor. If I go back to my floor's mesh instance 3D, to its bluey purple material, and under the materials properties, you can see that I've turned the roughness all the way down, and so at times you should see the reflection of other objects in the floor. It's not perfect though, because if I select that world environment node and go back to that acronym SSR, screen space reflections, the screen space part of that acronym, the reflection part, is pretty obvious. You're seeing reflections. Screen space though means that you're only going to see reflections for elements, or at least the sides of elements that you can actually see. So you can see here that as I take my game character and move him closer to the floor, you see more of the reflection right there of the side of Steve that we can actually see. However, if I zoom in, you'll notice that we're not getting any green reflection of the underside of Steve, his bottom surface, because we actually can't see that bottom surface on the screen right now. So this reflection is not totally accurate. You should see some green in this area, but we're not. So that's a limitation of most game engines. At least by default, you can't see reflections of things you can't see, although I believe there are ways of fixing that. We might touch upon those a little bit later in this course. What other options are there available to us to make the game look a little bit better? We've turned on screen space reflections. The next section is called SSAO. That stands for Screen Space Ambient Occlusion. Ambient occlusion, if I turn it on, should increase the realism of shadowy areas in my game, especially where objects are near to one another, where there are little tight crevices and areas where two faces come together and there would be a slightly darker shadow in those areas. Well, that's what ambient occlusion is. So turning this on, you might notice a little bit of variation in the shadows, and it might make those a little bit more realistic. I think screen space ambient occlusion is a good thing to have turned on. If you think that other computers running your game will be able to handle and play your game well with it turned on. Okay, everything that you turn on will decrease the performance just a little bit. Okay, let's go ahead and try this out. I'll press Control S. I believe there's one more thing I want to change. However, I'm going to point out that right now my game looks, well, a little bit jaggy. If I go ahead and zoom in this video so you can see the edges of objects, you can tell the edges look a little bit zigzaggy, a little bit saw-like, a little bit jaggy, if you will. And that's because your game does not have, your project doesn't have what's called anti-aliasing turned on. Anti-aliasing will fix these jaggy edges in your game by creating semi-transparent edges on different objects as they're drawn on the screen so that things kind of look a little bit more blurred at the edges. Not blurred in terms of blurry, but blurred in terms of not having these jaggy edges. It smooths things out. Okay, how do we do this? Well, anti-aliasing is not a property of your environment like screen space reflections and ambient occlusion. For this, we have to go up to our project settings. So under the project menu, project settings, I'm going to find under the general tab the section called rendering, which is right here. And there is a section called anti-aliasing. Right now, the anti-aliasing for 3D projects is disabled. So I'm going to change this to 2x average. If you feel like cranking up the anti-aliasing very high, go ahead and try these out. To keep my game more compatible with more devices, I'm going to use the simplest type of anti-aliasing, which should not slow down the game too much. With that, I'll press close and I'll save my project, Control S, and I'll press play scene. And now if I zoom in on my game, you should notice that it looks a little bit less jaggy, and I think that looks pretty good. If I were to turn up the anti-aliasing in my project settings, well, I think it might look a little bit better, but I'm happy with what we have. Okay, so I believe that's going to be it for this lesson. In this lesson, we've added materials to our mesh objects in our game level. We've added an environment and set up the environment with our own sky color, horizon, floor color, and we've customized the ambient light in the scene. We've turned on screen space reflections, ambient occlusion, as well as anti-aliasing. That'll be it for this one. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.